Hi everyone. So in today's video I want to discuss a little bit about portrait lenses and in what, in my opinion, makes a good portrait lens. I'm going to go through some of the lenses in my bag and show some examples. Now technically you can take a portrait with really any lens, anywhere from like a fisheye lens all the way to a super telephoto lens. There's really no rules as far as what type of lens you can use. But what I found are there are some sweet spots and some characteristics in the lens that is more flattering for portraiture than, let's say, other lenses. So I want to kind of go over that a little bit today and show some examples. A couple things that I look for in general for a good portrait lens. A wide aperture so I can have a shallow depth of field look, and it has to be sharp. So I want something sharp when I focus on the eye, that the image is nice and sharp. Fast focusing is not really super necessary. You want it to obviously focus, but it doesn't have to be lightning quick focus, especially if you're doing a standard portraiture where they're not really moving, or studio work. That isn't as big of an issue. For people that are moving fast, things like that, then obviously you're going to want something that focuses a little bit quicker. Okay, so first off, I hear a lot of people talking a lot about a 50mm lens for portraiture. On a full frame camera, I have used 50mm for portraits. On a full frame camera though, I find it to be a little wide, especially if you get close to your subject. You get a little bit of distortion, where you get a little barrel distortion where their nose looks wider, and they just look a little bit more disproportionate. Now, if you give yourself some distance from the subject, then a 50mm lens actually I think looks fine. But it's not my ideal lens for a portrait. What's nice about this lens, this here is a 50mm 1.4, so that's really nice. It's got the wide aperture like I mentioned, which throws the background out of focus, which I like. It's just really the focal length. I don't find it to be that great of a focal length for portraits. Now, also another lens that I'm 35mm 1.4, which I can't show you right now because I'm using it to film this video. But the Sigma 35mm 1.4 could be used as a portrait, but it just has the same thing as the 50, even more so. The closer you get, especially when you go down to shorter focal lengths, the closer you get to your subject, the more distortion, or you're susceptible to more distortion. So that's the only thing with those focal lengths. So you tend to want to go to the longer side of the focal lengths to get that compression of the facial features and the background compression as well, so you don't get any distracting elements in the background. That also helps. So that's that. Another lens that I use on occasion, but not my go-to lens for portraits, is the 24-70, which is a popular portrait lens. It's a good all-around lens where you can get things from the wide angle to somewhat of a narrow angle at the 70mm side on a full frame camera. And this lens is really sharp, which is also really important. I use this lens for portraits. I will use it when the backgrounds are more simplified, when there's not a lot of distracting elements in the background. Let's say they are outside and there's trees and things like that in the background. I wouldn't use this lens. I find that I'd rather use something else to kind of get the background out of focus, a little bit longer focal length. But this lens on simple backgrounds I find is nice. It's a 2.8 aperture, which is wide, which is nice. So you can get the background out of focus. It's nice and fast, which is good as far as fast focusing, which is nice to have, but it's not necessarily important for a portrait lens, and it's very sharp. So that's my thoughts on this lens. Now, getting into the longer lengths, one of the really popular portrait lens is the 85mm. Now, this focal length is really, I find, a sweet spot for taking portraits on a full frame camera. And that combined with a 1.4 aperture, it's like these lenses really are just made for taking great portraits, I believe. And the focusing is great. It has a 1.4 aperture, like I said earlier, and it's just a great focal length. And it's a prime lens, so So it's not as versatile as like a zoom lens, but if you're doing portraits, then prime lenses really are a good way to go. Another lens, just to go through quickly, is the 135 f2 DC. Now this is another longer focal length, meaning so you're going to need a little bit more space, even on a full frame camera, 135. You're going to need a little bit more space to get a shot, let's say a shoulder shot above. But this lens here has an extra feature where it has a defocus control. So this is a 135 f2 DC. So it has a DC standing for defocus control. So you can control the out of focus elements in the background or the foreground. You can slightly change it with the defocus control, which is a really cool feature. This lens also beautiful bokeh, fast because it has an f2 aperture, and focusing is great, and it's also sharp. So it has all those qualities as the other lens, as what you'd want in a good portrait lens. It gives you a different look, obviously, because it's 135 millimeter, so the perspective is a little bit different. Now, to get even longer, this is the 7200 2.8 VR2 lens. Now, this lens is great for portraits. It's really a super versatile lens because it has a nice focal length from 70 millimeters to 200, and it's really sharp all the way through the range, all apertures. It's sharp. And it's a 2.8 lens, so it's not as wide as, let's say, the 85 1.4, which this is a 1.4, so this is 4 times brighter than this lens. So this lens has the ability to throw the background out of focus even more. But with this lens, what you get is versatility because you can zoom from 70 millimeters to 200. So even at 200 millimeters, you can really compress the background. And you will need a little bit more room, obviously, if you're shooting at the 200 side. It's a 2.8, like I said earlier. This lens has VR, which in the Nikon world stands for vibration reduction. Canon calls it IS, which is for image stabilization, and the other manufacturers have their own names for it as well. It basically allows you to shoot in lower light, or actually not lower light, but typically that's when you would use it in lower light, is that with the VR on, you can shoot at slower shutter speeds and not have to crank up your ISO as high. So that's really helpful, especially if you're taking a portrait and it's more of like a candid moment. You're just trying to get like a headshot, not where you're setting up everything. That really helps, the VR does. So ideally, just to quickly step through everything again, my 3 choices for a portrait lens would be the 85 millimeter 1.4, the 135 f2 DC, and or the 70 millimeter 7200 2.8. Now, out of these 3 lenses, for portraits, I would probably go with the 85 or the 135, just because these 2 lenses here, they're really built specifically for that. They're just really, they shine in those portrait situations, especially with the super wide apertures that these 2 lenses have. Now, the 7200 is also very, very cool. And if I could only get one of these lenses, I would get the 7200 just because it's more versatile. Because it has VR, you can shoot in low light and low shutter speeds. It's a 2.8, which isn't as wide, isn't as fast, I mean, as the other 2 lenses, but it's more versatile. So you can use it for other things outside of portraiture. You can use it for a telephoto lens. It's super duper fast focusing. So out of all the lenses, this lens is probably the fastest focusing lens, and then the 24 to 70 is the next fastest. And it's very accurate as well. But if you're looking for an ideal portrait lens, specifically just for that purpose, I would probably go with one of these 2, the 85 or the 135. Now, of course, there are other lenses out there that I don't have, Nikon also makes a 105 f2 DC, same, exactly like this, only it's 105, not a 135. And there's the 200 millimeter f2, which I don't own. You know, I think that's a $5,000 to $6,000 lens. 200mm prime, and also those other lenses obviously. But I find that these lenses here, these three, cover my bases pretty well for portraiture. If you guys had any questions on that or any of these lenses, please leave them at the comments below. And thanks for watching.